Alright, so I decided to take a little bit of a detour from the set of videos I was going to make, which are still coming and are in the works, but I decided to take some time out to address something that I've been seeing a lot in my comments on the videos I've made about the Vikings and the Romans, and even the set of videos I made pertaining to how so-called blacks truly came to America from different countries in Europe, and this being the concept of DNA genetic studies being somehow, some way more reliable than a lot of the actual first-hand historical evidence I present in my videos that actually describe how people looked like in history. I've seen people state things like there is no quote-unquote DNA genetic evidence that the Vikings had so-called sub-Saharan African DNA ancestry, and that they had purely so-called white European ancestry according to quote-unquote genetic studies, or even there's very little to no quote-unquote sub-Saharan African DNA found in Europe during the medieval time period. So this means that blacks were never in Europe during that time period, and this somehow refutes all of the historical data that I give that proves the contrary. And I've seen even other so-called blacks who have upheld the same belief as well, that DNA ancestry studies can tell us more about the past than the people who actually lived and saw with their own eyes what happened. So all of this has led me to decide, before I heavily get into my medieval European series, to debunk a lot of these arguments pertaining to DNA testing being the end all be all in figuring out what certain groups of people look like in history, as well as how people today can trace their ancestry back to ancient populations from the past by simply just taking a DNA test from one of these scam companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com. And the reason why this is a necessity is because it is probably the main argument I've seen used against my claims that certain groups of people and civilizations were actually what we would call today so-called black in origin. And for a lot of naysayers that come onto my channel, it gives them the right to pass off my claims as quote-unquote Afrocentric in nature. So in order to refute those claims, let's dive into why I'm stating the things that I state pertaining to this field of genetic study by first understanding that geneticists or genetic group different ethnic groups. Geneticists group different ethnic groups according to something called a haplogroup, which is essentially how they identify which ethnic group a certain person belongs to, or racial category a certain person belongs to, whether they be someone living today or someone who lived thousands of years ago. There are a lot of different haplogroups that can entail different areas of the world, and tell about someone's ancestry and where they may have derived from. But some of the main ones are E1B1A, which is mainly found in West or quote-unquote sub-Sahara Africa, right? That's a quote-unquote sub-Saharan African group. And then you also have E1B1B, which is mainly the main haplogroup that is most compatible with people from the Middle East, North Africa, and places like Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, etc. And then there is R1b, which is most commonly found in Europe, and then M122, which is most commonly found amongst the peoples of Southeast Asia and Eastern Asia. So those are some of the examples of the different haplogroups that detail what ethnicity someone is according to the data and genetic research a genetic research facility may receive from a person who has sent their DNA over to one of these ancestry companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, or even a historical figure whose remains they've been able to dig up and gather a bunch of data from their mummified bodies on. One very well-known example of this is the body of King Tut that was examined along with others within his family around the late 2000s by one of the more well-known DNA genetic testing companies in Europe, based out in Switzerland, which is known as IGNA, if I'm not mistaken. And from these genetic studies, these geneticists from this company were able to come to the conclusion that King Tutankhamun was found to be part of the R1B1A2 haplogroup, which supposedly indicated that King Tut was of the European ethnic group, and this sparked a very bold claim by geneticists, or by the geneticists who came to this conclusion, as well as other genetic research facilities, that King Tut was not only just European, but that he was genetically related to 70% of all men from Great Britain, and was related to as many as 50% of all Western European men in general, since the same haplotype that most of these European men had, which was R1b1a2, was found to be compatible with King Tut's, which was also, as I stated earlier, R1b1a2. So we see here an obvious connection between the DNA of King Tut and Europeans, right? Which would obviously have to mean that King Tut himself was what we would call today a so-called Caucasian European, and would have looked something like this. This is a DNA reconstructive model of the face of King Tut, and he certainly looks like a so-called Caucasian man right here, or a Caucasian European man. So if we were to just take this supposed highly advanced genetic data on its face value and completely ignore the historical evidence pertaining to what figures like King Tut and even his family members look like, we can trust that this is indeed a reliable account of what he looked like while he was alive, right? Well, actually, this assumption would be an incorrect one to make, and in fact, what this is an example of is how geneticists actually manipulate the genetic data of a figure like King Tut and group him into a racial category that he does not belong to. And there is plenty of evidence to back this up. The first piece of it actually coming from a scientific genetic standpoint, which derives from an article that was written a couple of years ago after the study that was done on King Tut and his family that determined what ethnic group they belong to. So this article from one of the foremost scientific websites in the world, livescience.com, stated that the claims made by IGNA were quote-unquote unscientific, and it cites a German geneticist from the University of Tübingen, and this particular German geneticist was part of the team that actually examined King Tut's DNA in the original study by the name of Carson Pusch, if I'm not mistaken, but he stated that the claims of a European ancestry for King Tut and him being related to 50% of all Western European males that was made by IGNA was quote-unquote simply impossible. So the article then goes on to state that Carson Pusch and his team only used snippets of King Tut's DNA to link him with his closest relatives, which were his mother and his father, but they did not publish all of what they found from the data that they had to give genetic companies like IGNA the ability to be able to link up King Tut with any modern group of people. So therefore, there was absolutely no way of knowing if King Tut was part of the R1b1a2 haplogroup, as well as him being somehow linked to 50% of males from Western Europe and 70% of males in Great Britain. Another scientist from an independent research facility in Italy also stated that IGNA was very quote-unquote unscientific in how they chose to go about coming to the conclusion that King Tut belonged to the R1b1a2 haplogroup. So it is apparent that the claims made by this company, IGNA, which again is known as one of the foremost genetic research facilities in Europe, was false in their assertions about King Tut being genetically related to so-called Caucasian Europeans and Caucasian European men being descendants of his. But this is how DNA genetic research on ancestry pertaining to significant historical figures and entire civilizations usually work. Big companies like IGNA come out and make these claims and pass it off as true to everybody else, and they get their quote-unquote findings published in magazines and on the news, which leads people to actually believe that significant figures in history like Tutankhamun were so-called Caucasian. And then you have Caucasians that see this stuff, which reinforces their belief in their supremacy over the world since the beginning of time, and they run with it and cite what was stated by companies like IGNA. But as I stated earlier, most of the time, genetic evidence is oftentimes altered by these big research facilities to create or reinforce the narrative that every significant figure in history, no matter where they may have come from, were a particular race. And a lot of this comes from the very Eurocentric element that exists within these databases that research facilities use. Most of the genetic data pool these research facilities look at and implement into their research comes from peoples of quote-unquote European descent. On top of that, most of the participants in genetic research studies are of so-called Caucasian European descent, as per a study that was done in 2009 that found 96% of genetic researchers were of quote-unquote European descent, and then later on in 2019 it was found that the percentage dropped to only 80%, but that is still a very significant number of so-called Caucasian Europeans as opposed to other groups doing DNA genetic research studies. So it is fair to say that there's a little bit of a bias towards the quote-unquote European side of things in genetic research, which no doubt comes into play when they try to determine what a certain person or group of people looked like in history and what ethnic group they would have been identified with what ethnic group or racial group they would have been identified with if they were around today. Which brings us back to King Tut, who was again classified as R1B1A, which was specifically been dubbed as a European and even, I believe, Mesopotamian ethnic group. But what most geneticists won't say is that there is another variant of the R1B haplogroup known as R1B1B, and this particular haplogroup is found all over the Sahel region in Central Africa and is very common in countries within Africa such as Cameroon, Chad, Guyana, Mauritania, Mali, Niger, and Nigeria, and also the Senegal. Most of these African countries I just named are either in West Africa or Central Africa, which of course are mainly occupied by Black Africans. So who knows, IGNA could have found that the DNA of King Tut was compatible with that of the R1B haplogroup, but instead of classifying him as R1B1B, they classified him as R1B1A, which would in turn place him under the quote-unquote European ethnic group instead of the one he truly belonged under, which was the Black African or quote-unquote Sub-Saharan African group. And one of the definitive ways we know that this to be the case is by just looking at how he was depicted when he was alive, which is my preferred method of studying historical figures and what they look like, because when we do that, we can see that the likelihood of King Tut being part of the Black African ancestry versus the European ancestry increases even more, especially when you take a look at contemporary artwork made around King Tut's time period that clearly shows him as a Black African man. Here is King Tut's golden throne chair, and on the chair we can see that King Tut is depicted alongside his wife, and they are both clearly shown to be so-called Black Africans. They have the skin tone and the hair texture to confirm that they are indeed Black African. And then here is another depiction of King Tut and his wife, and again they are clearly shown to be Black Africans, evidenced by the hair and the skin color, and then also the facial features they both have. And then here is one last ancient depiction of King Tut, which is a bust of him. It's probably one of the most shown images of King Tut, other than maybe his world famous sarcophagus photo, but this is definitely one of the most frequently shown ancient depictions of King Tut. And some people like to assert that this does not depict him as a Black African, but rather as a Arab or Middle Eastern looking boy with reddish brown skin. But when you look at the bust in lighting that is not meant to make his skin look lighter than it actually did, which is one of the main tricks that a lot of these museums like to pull in order to get people to think that figures like King Tut from ancient Egypt had lighter skin than they actually did. But you can look at this bust and compare it to a bust that was made of one of King Tut's grandparents, Queen Tai, and see that they bear a striking resemblance to one another. This is the paternal grandmother of King Tut, and again you can clearly see that there is a resemblance there, and Queen Tai is one of the more obvious Black African looking ancient Egyptian figures that for whatever reason has been allowed to be portrayed as she originally was, which was as a Black African woman. And now that I'm on the subject of King Tut's grandparents, we can shift on over to King Tut's grandfather, Amenhotep III, real quick, and clearly see that he too was a Black African man, but like his grandson, King Tut, he has also had his image altered to fit the quote-unquote Eurocentric idea of ancient Egypt being a so-called Caucasian empire. This right here is an alleged authentic facial reconstruction of Amenhotep III, who was once again the grandfather of King Tut. Now obviously this shows a Caucasian looking man, which if we do the same thing with King Tut and just take into account his DNA facial reconstruction as well as the haplogroup Amenhotep III has been placed under, which is R1BH2, which again indicates someone who is of quote-unquote European ancestry, and will classify that person under the so-called Caucasian ethnic group today. But once again, when we take a look at how Amenhotep III was actually depicted during his lifetime, we can see that there is no way in hell he could have been of this ethnic group, and that this is yet another case of the quote-unquote Eurocentric bias towards genetic studies of historical figures and what they look like taking place here. Take a look at Amenhotep III here. This is a portrait of Amenhotep III that was found in one of his tombs, and it is an actual authentic image of what he looked like. As we can see, this is a man of clear Black African phenotype right? Woolly hair, dark brown skin, and a flat nose with thick prominent lips. It also bears a very striking resemblance to the depiction of King Tut on his own throne. One thing is for sure though, this is not a Caucasian man like the genetic test of Amenhotep III's DNA would suggest he was. This isn't even a man of quote-unquote Middle Eastern descent, which is the other ethnic group that geneticists like to group the ancient Egyptians with. But no, this is a black African man, okay? Clearly a black African man, and this can even further be seen when we look at other depictions of him, like this figure that was made of him around his lifetime, and again, it clearly shows him to be a man of color or a black African male. I'll just take some time out for you guys to look at these images real quick. And then one last one. This is a bust of Amenhotep III, and to me, this is the best existent bust of him in terms of how it depicts his facial features. It is very clear that he is a black African man from the looks of this bust. He, again, like the first depiction I displayed, is shown with a flat, wide nose and thick lips. Typical features of a man that belongs to the black African ethnic group. And this bust bears absolutely no resemblance to the quote-unquote authentic DNA remodel of Amenhotep III's face at all. This remodel shows him with pale skin, but the authentic portraits that were made during his lifetime shows him with dark brown skin. Okay, this remodel shows him with very thin lips, but the authentic bust that I just showed depicts him with very thick, prominent lips. So it is very clear that this remodel cannot be an accurate depiction of Amenhotep III. Neither can the classification as him being someone who belongs in the European haplogroup. Okay, so just like his grandson King Tutankhamun, and even his wife, who was classified under the haplogroup K, under the haplo K group, which is most compatible with European, no surprise there, and Middle Eastern ancestry. But again, just by taking a look at her authentic portrait from her lifetime, there is no way she fits the bill for any of those ethnicities. So she is yet another victim of this obsession these geneticists have with altering the course of history, and who was who in history. And one last individual example I'll show of an essential ancient Egyptian figure who has been altered by genetic studies is that of Ramses II. So Ramses II, like his predecessors King Tut and Amenhotep III, was the subject of genetic researchers examining his body so that they could find out what he looked like, and also what ethnic group he could be classified under, etc. And so once they did this, they came to a couple of conclusions as to what the alleged appearance of Ramses II would have been based on the DNA they were able to extract from his body. The first result is this, which shows Ramses II maybe looking like a Middle Eastern man who you would see in Egypt today, or even, of course, a Caucasian man from Europe today, and also possibly a Southern European. But either way, this is definitely a person that could be classified under a haplogroup that is either European leaning or Middle Eastern / Mediterranean leaning. But probably the most obvious example of the, again, Eurocentric leaning bias towards what historical figures look like comes from this AI regenerated image of Ramses II, using the alleged remains of his mummified body to come to this conclusion of him being a blonde-haired, pale-faced Caucasian man that would undoubtedly have fit within the R1b1a haplotype that so many Caucasian European males fall under. But just as it was with King Tut and Amenhotep III, the historical evidence from that time period tells us a completely different story from what these modern-day depictions tell us about the appearance of Ramses II. We don't even have to start with him. We can take a look at the man who is credited with starting the Ramesside dynasty in Egypt, the grandfather of Ramses II, Ramses I, and judging from his bust, judging from this bust of Ramses II's paternal grandfather, this particular pharaoh has the same facial features of a man who could be classified under the quote-unquote sub-Saharan African ethnic group. You can see the wide nose and thick lips this authentic bust of Ramses I shows him to have had. So a question that people should ask themselves before even looking up what Ramses II himself even looked like is, could a man who looked like how Ramses I was depicted in this bust have produced an offspring, a not so distant offspring, I might add, that looked completely and utterly disparate from this to this degree? like what both of these facial reconstructions displays Ramses II to have looked like doesn't seem probable in the least bit. So that should be people's first cue that this is not how Ramses II actually looked. But beyond just the complete difference in physical appearance between Ramses II and his grandfather, when you look up actual historical images of Pharaoh Ramses II, it becomes apparent that the two facial reconstructions that were made of him, supposedly from the DNA researchers who were able to gather from his mummified body remains, these cannot be accurate just by virtue of the skin color both these depictions show Ramses II to have had. This one shows Ramses II to have had what we would call today a quote-unquote olive skin tone, and this other one is just a straight pale-faced Caucasian man with maybe a bit of red undertone to his skin. But in reality, Ramses II during his lifetime was always depicted having a very medium to dark brown skin tone that looked nothing like what is shown in these photos. Here's an example of how Ramses II was portrayed in an actual authentic ancient Egyptian art piece. Here he is making an offering to the god Amen, and from the looks of his skin complexion, it is very reminiscent of the skin color one would see a person of black African descent have, not a Middle Eastern quote-unquote olive skinned person having, and certainly not a pale-faced Caucasian man having. Okay, here is yet another authentic historical depiction of Ramses II at one of his temples in Abydos, and once again he is shown with the deep dark brown or deep brown or maybe even dark reddish brown tint to his skin that is far more likely to have been seen amongst black Africans than a Middle Eastern or Caucasian European person. And if this is still not believed, if this is still not believed pertaining to the skin color of Ramses II being more akin to a black African than the other two races aforementioned, that he gets classified as, then just take a look at this image right here, which shows Ramses II in a war chariot charging into battle against the so-called Nubians, who have undoubtedly been identified as being part of the black African demographic in history. He is the exact same skin color as the vast majority of the Nubians, and even in some instances, he is even darker than a lot of these Nubians that are depicted in this picture. So again, Ramses II being shown with the dark brown skin color he was portrayed to have had historically indicates that he was a black African man and not a man of Middle Eastern, Near Eastern, and especially not European descent. So it is clear that he, just like King Tut, Amenhotep III, Queen Tiye, and a bevy of other ancient Egyptian figures is the victim. He is the victim of the incessant need to quote unquote Europeanize prominent historical figures through the usage of DNA testing, which should be most people's first clue into how unreliable this field is when we're trying to figure out who was who in history. Just as I stated earlier, most of the genetic data these companies have revolves around so-called Caucasian European DNA. So the likelihood of them injecting that into their own research when trying to inform people about a certain figure in history and what they look like is far higher than them being able to come to a true conclusion based on the historical data that is already available to us of how these figures really looked like in history. Just go back to the first example I used when I showed King Tutankhamun being completely wrongfully accused of being or of belonging to a genetic haplogroup that has been classified under the Caucasian demographic. People within the field of genetic studies themselves came out and stated that this was far from the truth and couldn't have even been possible to begin with. But yet, when the story was first published, people took it as the unabashed truth, and there are people still to this day who will believe this and they still will believe this to be true, believe it or not. So that is how history can be contorted when we just believe the quote unquote DNA evidence side of things and not take into account what has been plainly stated and portrayed in history. And an even more egregious example of Eurocentric DNA research manipulation can be seen still with the ancient Egyptians and this notion that they were closer to being European and related to modern day Europeans than to even modern day Egyptians, and certainly more so than black Africans. But then on the flip side, there was also a concerted attempt to classify the ancient Egyptians as being of a quote unquote Middle Eastern descent and not even having much quote unquote sub-Saharan African DNA to speak of. One geneticist from the University of Tübingen in Germany by the name of Johannes Krauss stated that for over 1,000 years, ancient Egyptian DNA had maintained complete continuity throughout the conquest of the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, and the Assyrians, and that there was very little sub-Saharan African DNA that could be found. This same geneticist even stated that the ancient Egyptians had more European DNA in their genome prior to the Macedonian Greek takeover of Egypt, led by Alexander the Great, than they did after. Where allegedly the increase of sub-Saharan African DNA started to become more prevalent. But once again, this is not what history tells us or shows us. And when one takes a deep dive into things regarding how the ancient Egyptians were described by outsiders and even how they portrayed themselves, it becomes very clear that neither outcome of the ancient Egyptians being of quote-unquote Caucasian or Middle Eastern / Near Eastern ancestry can be true. The most famous of these outsiders who described the ancient Egyptians was Herodotus, who was the ancient Greek scholar from the 5th century, and he actually lived before the Macedonian Greek population had made its way into Egypt, and he himself took a trip out to Egypt around the 450s to 440s BC and saw the ancient Egyptian population for himself. Although his account comes far after any of the dynastic periods in ancient Egypt's history, where the Aboriginal Egyptians ruled Egypt, and during the Irano / Persian Achaemenids ruling class at the time, the ancient Egyptian population was still well intact despite this foreign population intermingling with them, mainly due to them, the Persians, being of the same appearance as the ancient Egyptians. But anyway, Herodotus, in his account prior to the Macedonian Greek takeover of Egypt, compared the ancient Egyptian population to that of a civilization that had hailed from the Caucasus region in between Europe and Asia, known to history as the Colchians. And he stated that the ancient Egyptians themselves believed that the Colchians were their descendants, and he then doubles down on this belief by stating that the Colchians definitely were of Egyptian descent due to how they looked. His exact words were, "Still the Egyptians said that they believed the Colchians to be descended from the army of Sesostris. My own conjectures were founded first on the fact that they are black-skinned and have woolly hair." Now, some historians are skeptical about this quote from Herodotus and what he actually said, mainly pertaining to, of course, the description of the Colchians and by osmosis the ancient Egyptians being called by Herodotus black-skinned and woolly-haired. And this right here is a bit of an example of how even historical information can be manipulated as well, but that is a conversation for another day. But getting back to this quote from Herodotus, yes, a lot of historians and translators are very skeptical of the assertions that were made by Herodotus of the Colchians and the ancient Egyptians being black-skinned and woolly-haired. But what can put this incredulity or disbelief to rest is the statements that were made by later scholars who visited the land of the Colchians, and who visited the Colchians far later after Herodotus, and stated a similar thing about the Colchians' appearance and how they looked back during their time period. According to the French theologian Samuel Bocart, two early Christian church figures by the names of Saint Jerome and Sophronius, who themselves visited the Colchians, called their land a quote-unquote second Ethiopia. Sophronius then also stated that a river known as Phasis, which was a river that the Colchians were known to have lived by, he stated that there were a bunch of Ethiopians that were by this river that he saw, and he was talking about the Colchians when he made that statement. And it does not stop there. The 6th century ancient Greek poet Pindar also stated that the Colchians were quote-unquote black-faced in one of his famous Pythian poems. I could not find the exact quote from the poem, but here is a citation from one of Harvard's studies on Greek classical history. And while we're on this study, we can see right next to the citation of Pindar that it states yet another ancient Greek poet by the name of Aeschylus stated that the ancient Egyptians were black in his famous Suppliants play. And staying within the realm of the ancient Greeks and their understanding of what the ancient Egyptians looked like, the famous ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus made the assertion based off of the information he was able to gather from his travels into the land of Egypt that the ancient Egyptians were originally a colony of Ethiopians or black Africans that upheld the same or similar laws, cultural customs, and religious practices as the Cushites, and even says that they retain the same practices as their ancestors, the Ethiopians. And please keep in mind that Diodorus lived in the post-Macedonian Ptolemaic takeover of Egypt. So if the sentiment pertaining to Egypt only later becoming more, as geneticists like to say, quote-unquote sub-Saharan African was true, then how come Diodorus makes it perfectly clear that the original ancient Egyptians not even had a large black African population amongst them, but that they themselves were black Africans? So it's clear that Egypt could not have been more black African after the Macedonian conquest due to already being comprised of Black Africans before the influx of European DNA first became introduced into Egypt during the Ptolemaic era. Here is where, during the Ptolemaic era, is where we can see a definitive change in the overall makeup of the ancient Egyptian population. All one has to do is take a look at some of the Fayum mummy portraits to clearly be able to see that Egypt underwent significant changes in the overall genetic makeup of its inhabitants. Some of which you can tell were the product of the original Black African ancient Egyptian population. A lot of them look like mixed race Black Africans themselves. And if there is any need for proof of this, we can compare and contrast the artwork from the post-Macedonian takeover time period in Egypt and the artwork that was made by the original ancient Egyptians from the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom periods, and see that the paintings of the figure and the figurines and other forms of art depict the ancient Egyptians just as Herodotus, Diodorus, and by osmosis Pindar, Saint Jerome, and Sophronus described them as, which was as a people of black skin, and according to Herodotus, they also had woolly hair. So again, I ask, how could the ancient Egyptians have been European, Middle Eastern / Near Eastern, or any other race besides how they were anciently described and portrayed by outsiders as well as by their own people? So with that particular civilization, DNA genetic evidence has failed to give us an accurate and, dare I say, honest account pertaining to what the appearance of the ancient Egyptians were. And this is only the first example of how unreliable DNA evidence can be, and oftentimes is, when evaluating what a certain group of people or individual historical figures look like. Another example of this inconsistency with how DNA evidence describes historical civilizations comes in the form of none other than the ever controversial racial identification of the Moors, but truly not just the Moors, but all of the ancient populations in northern Africa. North African populations such as the Berbers, the Numidians, and the Saracens, along with the Moors, have been identified by geneticists as being part of the Middle Eastern or Mediterranean haplogroups, whether they be E1, B1, B1, B2, which is very commonly identified in North Africa, or even E-M81, which has high frequencies in Tunisia amongst Arab populations. And a third common haplogroup is haplogroup J, which is often identified with either the Middle East or Western Asian populations. The specific type from group J that gets thrown around is J1A or J2, and also M304, which is commonly seen in the Middle East, but not surprisingly, haplogroup J is also consistent with European populations too. So once again, we see that underlying attempt to try and make all of history Caucasian using the number one weapon they have in their arsenal, known as DNA genetic testing. But either way, this is how the ancient peoples of North Africa would have looked like according to genetic studies. And if we were to make the same mistake that others make, and just strictly look at these genetic studies without taking into account how the people who actually lived during the ancient or medieval times and saw what these people looked like with their own two eyes, described them, just like with the ancient Egyptians, who really is the more reliable source on who these civilizations look like? The people who either saw or lived within these particular civilizations during that time period, or the ones who conduct relatively high-level guesswork known as genetic DNA testing. That is essentially what DNA genetic testing is. It's nothing but guesswork, which is why if you do research on each haplogroup, no one group belongs to a specific race. There was always a probability that a particular haplogroup could belong to another group that differs from the one that it is mainly attributed to. For example, haplogroup J is found frequently in countries like Yemen, near Western Asia and the Middle East, but it is also frequently found within the Caucasus region, and at the same time, it is also frequently found in Europe, from places like Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, but can still be found in places like Asia and in areas in Asia like India and China, while also existing in other places within the Middle East like Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Malta, etc. So in other words, the only real way for DNA genetic researchers to know what someone's ethnic group who is of haplogroup J is by guessing based on what area the haplogroup variant is most frequent in, but even that is not definitive. So once again, most of DNA genetic research is just guesswork, and it certainly shouldn't be looked at as more reliable than accounts of scholars who visited these regions while the ancients were still living while the ancients were still living, there was. And when we look at what scholars had to say concerning the physical appearance of the ancient peoples of North Africa, it will aid us in understanding what they looked like, far different from what the majority of the population that lives in that region of the world today looks like. And so again, we turn back to Herodotus to see what the ancient inhabitants of places like Libya, which was first occupied by the Berbers, had to say about them. And keep in mind that Herodotus visited Libya during his trek across the Persian Empire, so he did see the ancient inhabitants of Libya as they were at the time, and he stated, "For the eastern Ethiopians have straight hair, while they of Libya are more woolly hair than any other people in the world." Okay, so that's a far cry from what one would think a modern inhabitant of North Africa would look like today, since most of them do not have close to anything resembling woolly hair. That term woolly hair, for those of you who don't know, is a term that is oftentimes used to describe the hair of a black person or a black African person. This hair type is almost exclusively seen amongst Negroid so-called blacks, so much to the point where if it is seen in any other race that aren't classified under the so-called black ethnic group, it is literally categorized as an epidermal or hair disorder. So Herodotus, referring to the ancient Libyans or Berbers as woolly haired, is a good indicator of what their true physical appearance was at the time. But if someone were to need a more visceral description of these Libyans or Berbers, then look no further towards the statements that were made by a very prominent 6th century Roman poet by the name of Corippus, who saw a large group of Berbers led by a chief that went by the name of Antalis. And this Roman poet, who, like Herodotus, saw the Libyans at this time in person with his own 2 eyes, stated that they had black faces, quote unquote black faces. So a person who again saw the Berbers or Libyans as they were during the beginning stages of the medieval time period, round about the 6th century, stated that they had black faces, which combined with Herodotus's statements about them having woolly hair should let us know that how the Berbers or peoples of ancient Libya looked like in former years. Another medieval source, who was a Muslim bibliographer and biographer from Baghdad by the name of Ibn al-Nadim, stated in his chronicle, the Firist, that the races of what he called Negroes were the Nubians, the Beja peoples of the Sudan and southeastern Egypt, the Zaghawa people of Libya, right? The Zaghawa people of Libya, the Merowa, the Istan, and the Berbers. Now, the first 2 peoples that are mentioned, the Nubians and the Beja peoples, have always been historically identified as being black Africans. So the fact that the Berbers were grouped into this list of what Ibn al-Nadim described as Negroes says a lot about what these Berbers looked like, even going into the medieval time period. And yet another medieval Muslim chronicler upholds the same understanding, that the appearance of the Berbers through his description of Berber slave women were so-called black, stating that their color is mostly black, though some pale ones can be found among them. So again, we see the occurrence of Berbers being mentioned as black, i.e. black Africans from the northern parts of Africa, and these statements were made by people who once again saw the Berbers or Libyans for themselves and didn't just conduct a form of guesswork to try and see what the Berbers may have looked like hundreds of thousands of years ago. Yet another example of the ancient appearance of the Berbers can be found from the descriptions of specific Berber tribes from the time of Diodorus Siculus, who stated that 3 Libyan or Berber tribes known as the Mekatani, the Zufani, and the Asfandalani, or Asfalati, resembled the skin color of the Ethiopians, who were always traditionally identified as black Africans by Greek writers like Diodorus. So again, we see the physical appearance of the North African Libyans being more akin in former times to black Africans than any Arab or quote unquote Middle Eastern ethnic group today, according to ancient and medieval sources who actually saw what they looked like. But the ancient Libyan Berbers of North Africa were not the only North African / Muslim demographic who often get classified under the quote-unquote Middle Eastern ethnic group by genetic studies, who in earlier times were depicted as black. 2 examples of this are the Moors from North Africa and the Saracens, who were originally a tribe of Arabs. Now, both of these terms were words that eventually became synonymous with all of the people who adhere to the Muslim religion, the terms of Moor and Saracen. during the Middle Ages, but originally they denoted the native inhabitants of such lands as Mauritania, in the case of the Moors, and Arabia in the case of the Saracens. But just speaking of the name that denoted the Moors, for number one, its etymological origin traces all the way back to ancient Greece in the form of the word moros, which quite literally means black. And during the Middle Ages, the term Moor was used as a synonym for a Negro or so-called black person. Even subsequent to the Middle Ages, the term was still used as a synonym for a black person, as was evidenced by Shakespeare's usage of the word in most of his plays to denote a black person, whether it be Othello the Moor, or Aaron the Moor, or the Moorish Prince of Morocco from the play The Merchant of Venice. So if this term Moor was used as a word to denote original inhabitants of this particular place in North Africa, i.e., Mauritania, Morocco, etc., and the name of the Moors originally came from the Greek dialect, and it meant black, and then later on it became a synonym for a Negro in later times, it must be fair to assert that the Moors could not have been of the appearance that modern-day North Africans are today, but they had to be, as their name originally implied, so-called black. And this was a sentiment that was originally upheld by the Europeans during the Middle Ages when they came into contact with the Moors during the over 2-century-long conflict known as the Crusades. The Europeans, who, as I will continue to remind the viewers, actually saw the Moors during their time, depicted them, as their name entails, as black. Here are some images that make it very clear as to why the Europeans chose to utilize the word Moor as a synonym for a Negro during the Middle Ages. The Moors, the original Moors of Mauritania, who were alluded to by people like the ancient Greeks as being quote-unquote black by virtue of what the name that was given to them entailed, those same Moors were depicted as blacks by the same people who saw, encountered, and interacted with them. So the Moors were actually a black, or maybe it can be more properly said, a black African people rather than a quote-unquote Middle Eastern, Near Eastern, or Arab people. This being according to actual real history rather than DNA genetic guesswork that favors a more Middle Eastern or Arab look of what the Moors were said to have looked like. As for the Saracens, though, again, we see the same narrative pertaining to their lineage according to DNA genetic studies that classify them as being of the E-M123 haplogroup, which according to them is most commonly seen in the Middle East today. So again, this is a ploy to try and group them up with the modern day inhabitants of the Middle East. But if we do what we have been doing throughout this entire video and actually take a look at the primary sources that give a contemporary description of what they looked like, it paints a completely different picture. First off, the Saracens were described in the medieval chronicle that documented the adventures of Richard the Lionheart during the Crusades as such. With them also were the Saracens, who live in the desert, called Bedouins. They are a savage race of men, blacker than soot. And what the Saracens are being compared to in this passage is a powdery substance known as soot, which is quite literally black in color for the most part. So the fact that they are having their physical appearance being compared to that substance is very telling in regards to what these Saracens must have looked like. Another example of the historically documented black skin complexion of the Saracens comes from a series of medieval texts written in the 14th century that have been dubbed as the Auchinleck text after the Scottish Lord Alexander Boswell, who was Lord of the village of Auchinleck in Scotland. And although I do not have the direct quotes that come from that manuscript, an associate professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, who specializes in such things like the Crusader texts and medieval texts like the Auchinleck texts, lets us know right here in this book written primarily about the Saracens that they were mentioned 4 times in the Auchinleck manuscripts as being, as she puts it, explicitly identified as black-skinned people. So the Saracens were described as being literally a people of black skin color in just those few medieval texts I cited from. And one other portrayal of the Saracens the Europeans would create of them, besides the written down accounts of what they looked like, is through the actual visual art they created depicting the Saracens. An art historian by the name of Heather Madar stated that skin tone helped define the Saracen, and the black or dark-skinned Saracen is commonplace in both medieval art and literature. So she confirms that the Saracens were not only identified as black in their literature, such as the few that I referenced, but also in art. Their quote-unquote black or dark complexions can be seen as well. And just like with the Moors, there are an abundance of medieval art pieces that depict the Saracens as they were described as a people of black complexion. Medieval manuscripts made all throughout the Crusader time period display the Saracens as a group of blacks with brown to dark brown to even just straight up black skin pigmentation. So the Saracens are yet another ethnic group that has been falsely identified with an ethnic group that they did not originally belong to. Okay, but both the Moors and the Saracens were definitely not quote unquote Middle Eastern, or what we would think that term implies today in regards to their physical appearance and how they looked. So as I move to a close with this video, I again just want to emphasize the reasoning behind this video being made, which was to show and display to both my subscribers and to other people alike who I have seen ask as to why I don't use DNA genetic research in my videos. And if it's not clear by now based off of the content of this video and why that is, then I'll simply just say it is because DNA genetic research or DNA genetic evidence is an unreliable source of information pertaining to what certain civilizations during the ancient times to the medieval time period actually looked like. It is an especially less reliable source than the actual first-hand accounts and depictions in art that actually came from those specific time periods, which is why I pretty much strictly use historical information, since that is the most authentic and sincere form of data we have at our disposal. And that is not to say that historical information can't be unreliable as well, but even more sensationalized historical texts that border on mythology can often tell us more about the real history of these ancient civilizations than DNA genetic research can, okay, or aka guesswork can. So that is why I felt compelled to create this video before I go any further into the medieval time period, because I know that it will be something that is brought up a lot by my subscribers and a lot of detractors who come onto my channel. But before I close out this video, I just want to go over another historical civilization that more than any other has been the cause for a lot of controversy over the years pertaining to who this particular group of people were in history and who they even are today and what they looked like originally. These people are known historically by various different names. They're known as the Jews, the Hebrews, specific tribal names like the Danites or the Reubenites, the Levites, the Benjamites, the Samaritans, etc. All of these names describe the same people who we know today as the Israelites, and their descendants today are again the cause for much controversy pertaining to who exactly has the right to carry the title of quote unquote God's chosen people living on earth today. And this controversial topic will be talked about later on far more extensively on my other channel dedicated to biblical topics. But for now, for the sake of this video, I will just briefly address this issue real quick. So when it comes to the Jews, more specifically the biblical Jews of antiquity, according to DNA genetic research, they are by far and away without question the most closely related to the modern day Jews of today that go by various different names. The main group of Jews that most identify though are the Sephardic Jews, the Israeli Jews, and then the Ashkenazian Jews, who themselves, the Ashkenazian Jews, make up about 50% of the overall Jewish population in Israel too, so they can account for a large stake in the Israeli Jewish state as well. But these three main groups of Jews, as well as a bevy of others, are who most modern day geneticists identify as the only true Jewish race on the planet Earth. Most of the genetic studies that have been done on the Jews were conducted to prove this to be true, but one of the main reasons for there being a need to prove that the modern day Jews are in fact descendants of the biblical Jews was because of a book that was written in 1976 that challenged the belief that the modern day Jews are unequivocally the descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. This book was written a little bit after the end of the Holocaust in 1945, about 31 years subsequent to those events. So still by then, the thoughts of quote unquote anti-Semitism and being sensitive towards the so-called plight of the Jews were at a very high rate. I'm not going to go into the details or into the particulars too much in this video about this issue, because for number one, it will be included in another video for another day on my biblical channel, and for number two, it is just too controversial to get into for this particular video, so I'll save that for a later date. But when the first genetic study that found the modern day Jews being the same genetically to the biblical Jews of antiquity was done in 1992 by G. Lukat and F. David, it was largely due to a theory that has been credited to the the author of the aforementioned book I referenced that was written in 1976, who was named Arthur Koestler, who wrote the infamous book known as the 13th Tribe and proposed a theory that has become known as the Khazarian theory, which supposes that the modern day Jews who claim descent from the 12 tribes of Israel were actually not the descendants of the biblical Jews, but were actually descended from a group of Europeans known as the Khazars, who established a large empire in the Caucasus region of Europe and Asia known as Khazaria. Arthur Koestler supposed that the modern-day Jews like the Ashkenazis, the Israelis, and the Sephardic Jews, as well as others, were the descendants of Jews that converted to Judaism in the 8th century AD, that after they were conquered and taken out of power by the Rus Vikings, were spread out into different countries in Europe, such as Germany, Poland, Russia, and other places in northern and southern Europe, etc. But Koestler, who I should make clear was a Jew himself, did not believe that his own people were descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel. And again, this is for another video series for another day. But just as there are genetic studies that supposedly prove Arthur Koestler's Khazarian theory wrong, there are also genetic studies that prove him correct as well, or supposedly prove him correct as well. But again, this is a story for another day, for another video. But one tool we can use to figure out who was right between Arthur Koestler and the geneticists who attempted to refute his claims is by doing what we've been doing throughout this entire video, and what the main crux of this video is, which is to prove that the historical evidence available to us concerning what civilizations truly look like in history is a more reliable source than DNA genetic guesswork that has been passed off over the years as a definitive answer to the mysteries of antiquity. And when we truly look into history, we get the same results we've been seeing throughout this whole entire video from all of the examples I have given. One of the most ancient historical images of the Jews in existence are a series of scenes that were created on slabs of stone tablets known as reliefs. These reliefs were created during the 7th century BC, which was still during the time of the Jewish Empire in Israel, mentioned mainly in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, and also 1st and 2nd Chronicles, as well as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, etc., which would date it before they were conquered by the Babylonians in the early 6th century AD. So these tablets are a more than accurate depiction of the ancient biblical Jews and what they look like. And when we take a look at these tablets, you can see that these are Negroid characteristics. These people are being depicted with Negroid characteristics and the physical appearance of these Jews, and that are being shown as captives of the Assyrian Empire. The hair is one of the things that stands out to most people when they look at these reliefs, although some people say that the hair of the Jews that are shown on this depiction is no different from the hairstyles that most Jews have today when they cut their hair to a short length. But this opinion is not held by art historians and archaeologists who have observed these ancient tablets and came to the conclusion that the Lachish reliefs do indeed depict the Jews with what we would call today, quote unquote, kinky or woolly hair. One such archaeologist who commented about the appearance of the Jews on the Lachish reliefs by the name of Sabatino Mascati, who was known very well for specifically examining Middle Eastern populations such as the Phoenicians and the Punics, states that the Hebrews deported from Lachish are depicted with straight protruding noses and kinky hair with tightly curled beards. I referenced this term kinky hair earlier just by a different word. The word woolly, which is the term I alluded to in this video, is basically the same term as kinky and is a word that specifically indicates quote unquote Afro textured hair. The term woolly hair is also used to describe the Jews. The term woolly haired is also a term that is used to describe the Jews that are depicted from Lachish by a Harvard University theology book known as the Expositor, which has the contributions of many prominent European ministers from the 20th century. Okay, a quote from the book states that the captives of Lachish, for the most part, are represented as having woolly hair. And could have been mistaken. The Jews from this relief could have been mistaken for Ethiopians. So yet again, we see that the Jews were observed as having woolly hair by biblical scholars who examined the ancient reliefs, and this upholds with the admission by the English Cyclopedia, which has been a very prominent source of knowledge pertaining to the history of the world for centuries, and one of the most well-cited from encyclopedias in the world. And it states that the Jews were originally, quite literally, a quote-unquote dark-skinned, woolly-haired race. So according to these relatively modern scholars and scholarly accounts, the Jews were a race that originally could have been regarded today as so-called black, which would definitely be contrary to the idea idea that genetic ancestry studies uphold today, which is that the modern-day Jews are the descendants of the 12 tribes from antiquity. But a question that can be asked is, where could these scholars be getting this information from to come to these conclusions? Could they be pulling from ancient and even medieval sources that identify the Jews as a quote-unquote dark-skinned and woolly-haired race? Well, we'll find that when we look at some of these earlier quotes describing the appearance of either the Jews as a whole or specific Jewish figures. We will find the way that they are described does uphold with the notion that they were originally a quote-unquote Negroid people. One of the early references to the appearance of the Jews comes from an ancient description of 4 Jewish boys who were being sent as prisoners as a gift to the pharaoh Ptolemy. The first one was named Hymos, and he was described with black skin and tightly curled hair. The second one was called Atikos, and he was also described with black skin and tightly curled hair, but he is also described as having a flat nose as well. And then the other Jewish boys were named Audmos and Okimos, and Audmos was described having curly or woolly hair and a flat nose, and Okimos was described as having a flat nose as well, but also gray eyes, straight hair, and a ruddy complexion, which ruddy back then in the ancient world meant more of a reddish brownish color or a reddish brownish skin complexion. So we see that these descriptions of these 4 Jewish boys all uphold the same sentiment that the modern authors are cited from stated about the appearance of the Jews, which is that they were in fact a black, or as the description of the first 2 Jewish boys stated, a black complexioned and woolly, i.e. tightly curly haired people. And even more distant descriptions of the Jews from the 17th and 18th centuries describe them as a black people. Various quotes from first-hand accounts who saw what the Jews looked like around this time stated that they were black, one of them being a man who visited a Jewish synagogue in Amsterdam in 1635, stated that the Jewish men were quote-unquote black. And yet another observer of these Jews by the name of John Greenlaw, who visited a Jewish synagogue in London and saw a very prominent Jewish leader who he referred to as a quote-unquote chief ruler, stated that he was a big, black, fierce, and stern man. Okay, this same man, John Greenlaw, went to visit a synagogue of Jews that numbered about 100 or so and stated that the Jews were all generally black. And one last quote I will cite is from the Reverend Robert Kirk of Aberfoyle in 1690, who visited the same exact synagogue that the aforementioned John Greenlaw visited, and he stated that the Jews were all very black men. So the description of the Jews being so-called black, like what was seen earlier from the scholars who described the Jews as such from the Lachish beliefs, seem to have upheld from the ancient times. The description seems to have upheld from the ancient times to the somewhat post-medieval time period in the 17th century, and even carried over to the understandings most 19th and 20th century scholars had of what the Jews looked like. Okay, and obviously the Jews of today do not look like how they were described by these former chroniclers, nor do the Jews of the biblical time, period. Some of which we saw from the Lachish beliefs could have been related to the modern day Jews who claim that ancestry today and look nothing like the people from the ancient world whose culture they claim to be a part of. So the question begs to be asked, could these statements made by Arthur Koestler have been true pertaining to the Jews of today not being the biblical Jews mentioned in the scriptures and various other historical accounts? Well, like I stated earlier, that is not a question that will be answered in this video on this page. It will be for another day on my other page. But what we can infer is that, once again, here is another civilization whose historical descriptions by people who actually saw them in person differ from what the genetic DNA ancestry tests tell us their lineage was. So now that we are at the end of this video, it should be clear by now that DNA genetic testing is not an accurate or reliable source to figure out what people from the ancient and even medieval or even post-medieval world looked like. And this will be essential to remember as we move forward with this Medieval Europe series, especially with how frequently the usage of DNA genetic evidence is utilized to completely change the narrative about what certain figures of that time period and whole civilizations that settled in Europe and became the main inhabitants of that country all throughout the medieval time period looked like. So when the question is asked of me, well, what about DNA genetic evidence? What about what DNA genetic evidence says about such and such and such and such people in history? Just refer back to this video if you have those questions, and then you'll have your answer as to how I feel about that topic, or about this topic, and why I do not use DNA genetic evidence in any of my videos, and more importantly, that DNA genetic ancestry testing is again unreliable. So that will conclude this video, and be sure to look out for the next video that will officially kickstart the medieval time periods series.